Welcome to the Movement Upgraded podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Jen Hassler, licensed physical therapist and certified strength and mobility coach. Here you can expect to hear about all things movement. The Movement Upgraded podcast is a blend of the science of strength training, rehab, and mobility, mixed with the personal and professional experience to provide you with the steps you need to keep your body pain-free and moving well, so you can do what you love forever. Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about programming. So if you are a coach who programs for other people, or maybe yourself, if you are somebody who is just a movement nerd or a movement hobbyist, I might refer to you as, where you do your own programming and you're interested in how to kind of blend strength training, like traditional strength training programming, with mobility training, this is for you. If that's not interesting to you, if you don't do that, this may not be as relevant to you, but you might be interested nonetheless in hearing some of this. So that is going to be what we talk about today. I'm going to give you 4 different ways to blend mobility training with strength training, basically how to take your already existing infrastructure, so you probably already have a way of programming for clients or for yourself, and how to start implementing some of your mobility work in with that. For the purposes of this episode, we're mostly going to talk again about mobility with traditional strength training programming. Strength training programming traditionally is like you do a program, the same program every week for multiple weeks in a row. That's like the very bare minimum basics of strength training programming. So if you're somebody who's like, oh yeah, I program my own workouts, but you kind of just do like random things, I would highly recommend going and listening to my strength training episode. We talk about specificity and the importance of being consistent with strength training. So it's fine if that's what you do and you're doing random things, right? And it's fine if that matches and is in line with your goals and your expectations. But for this purposes, if you really want to work on your mobility, as we kind of go into more mobility training, we're kind of funneling down the specificity funnel is what I like to say. So if you're getting into mobility work or you want to get into mobility work, you have to be okay with doing similar things over and over and over again. So that you can get the adaptations that you want. And that's how strength training works, and that's exercise science 101. And so that's how mobility works too, because really we're just trying to get adaptations in the body, which require consistent efforts, consistent inputs into the body to tell the body what to change, right, to make those adaptations. So go listen to that podcast episode if you are kind of confused on that. But if you're not, you're ready to go, then we are going to chat. We're just going to get right into it. I will say that the way that I program and these ideas are not the only way. And I like to think of programming as an art. It's definitely a science, right? Like there's a science to it. We have to understand the basic science principles. I'm big on that. It kind of lays the foundation, but there are so many ways to skin the cat, for lack of better terminology. And there's just so many ways to reach the same goal. And I think a while back I had a question somewhere along the lines of like, what's the best way to get a second pull-up now that I've gotten my first, or to get my pull-up strength better? And there is no best way. Like that's kind of what I said in that there's no best way. And that's actually one of the things I love about strength training. When I was first getting involved in fitness, I thought there was, like, I thought I was constantly missing out on like, I don't know enough. There's got to be these these certain ways, these certain things that we have to abide by. And I felt like a lot of what I was reading, which was just a lot of like, I don't want to call it bro science because some of it was founded in science, but it was just like they're all dudes and they just were like, no, my way is the way, right? Like they like to argue, but in reality, there's just so many different ways to do the same thing and to accomplish the same things with strength training. And that's one of the things that I love about it. Every coach has their own style, and it's just like their own personality or their own ways of implementing or looking at things. And obviously it's going to be dictated and guided by your goals and where you are currently, or where your clients' goals are and where your clients are like to start. But from there, it's really an art form and kind of learning different things. And there's so many different techniques and tools and ways to implement things. So I just want you to know that like, If you do things differently and you put your mobility programming differently than what I'm telling you today, by all means, that does not mean that you're doing it wrong. And I'm not out here to argue that my way is the best way. It's just the way that I found that one, I like this way. Like personally, I like how it feels. My clients like this because it is simple, but yet it still gets results. And I like how I put these things together. So because of that, I'm sharing it with you. So take it or leave it if you want. If you want to implement a couple of these things and start playing around with it, that's what I highly recommend. The way that I started with mobility training was very much just like play. I was like, okay, let me play. Like I'll do my workout and then I'll play with mobility stuff. Of course, I didn't actually get results until I started to be consistent, but the playing around was a very important, necessary step in one, making me like realize kind of like where my deficits were, but two, it got me like a little bit of results. Like it made me feel a little bit better. And then I was like, oh, wow, okay, I want a little bit more of a taste of this. So if that's you, playing's totally fine. Highly recommend it in all the ways. But with mobility work, just kind of playing around a little bit, but also recognizing that you probably won't get the results you're wanting mobility wise until you're really consistent. So that is just something to keep in mind. So with that, without further ado, let's move into my first favorite way to implement mobility work. And this is just supersetting mobility work with like your main lift. And the mobility work that I'm referring to is going to be mobility work that you know you need. So in a couple of these other examples, I'm going to tell you that you can kind of get away with doing some mobility work without an assessment and still getting results, because some of the mobility work, I've talked about this in Kinstretch before, but some of the exercises are actually like really good assessment tools or learning opportunities for you to learn about your body. And that's one of the things that I love about them. Obviously, you know, an assessment is going to be top tier because there's a hierarchy of things that we pay attention to. So if you're somebody who's like, no, I know my deficits, I've been assessed, or I've assessed myself, but you're like, I just don't know how to implement this, put your deficit work, like the stuff that you know. For example, if it's, I love to pair specifically like capsular work. So rotational work for your shoulder or your hip or your knee with your big lift for the day. And I'm going to give you examples of this, of course, so, you know, don't get too overwhelmed. But I like to do that. One, I used to think originally, like way back in the day, I was like, oh my gosh, if I do anything with my main big heavy lifts, it's going to make my lifts worse because it's going to take my energy away from them and I'm not going to have energy and I'm not going to be as strong. And mind you, I'm like laughing at myself now. And this humor is very important. We should always be able to laugh at ourselves, right? But I'm laughing at myself now because I was not strong back then and I was not even lifting near my max. So it's just like ironic that I was worried about that. It's like the argument all the time of people who are like, you cannot work on cardio and strength in the same workout because they'll compete with each other. You only have so much inner energy, blah, 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 blah. But in reality, like the only time they really compete with each other when you're training for both in a block is when you're at your like max level, and you're not. I know you're not because you're listening to this, and I don't think I have like the top 1% of elite athletes listening to my podcast. And even so, some of the athletes, like I've worked with a handful of athletes. I don't think I've ever worked with any professional athletes. Ryan has a couple times. He worked with also some retired NFL athletes, but I've only worked with high school, college level. And even them, I do the same thing here because they're not at their peak. And mobility is still really important. And strength is not the most important part for those athletes. So unless you're getting paid, you probably like for your strength specifically, right? Like for your sport, you probably don't need to worry about it impacting your performance as much, especially when we consider that joint mobility is just like one of those really important things. It's like, what are our priorities here? Like performance in the short term or our joints being nice and healthy and strong and mobile in the long term? So keep that in mind if you're worried about it like affecting your lift. So that's the first thing. It's probably not going to be a big deal. The second thing is actually for most people that I've worked with, it like makes their lifts feel better. So I'll give you an example of one of my favorite ways or one of my favorite like pairs that I like to do. And that is going to be squats, like my heavy squats or my squats that day, my big lift with like hip internal rotation work. So a lot of us don't realize that hip internal rotation is really important for not just our hip like mobility, our hip ability, I should say, but also for squatting, getting out of the hole. We need a lot of hip internal rotation strength. Hip internal rotation is just like overlooked all the time, but It is really important, and it really is a good putting hip internal rotation work is a really good pair with squatting. It just feels amazing, and I highly recommend trying it out. And the way that I would do this, so let's give you like a good example, like a good solid example. Maybe you have like 5x5 squats programmed, right? So it's pretty heavy. 5 sets of 5 squats mean you have 5 sets to work with. You don't have to fill every single set, like superset it with your mobility work. But if you're doing 5x5, you're probably resting somewhere between 2, 3, 4 minutes in between. And if you're doing that, that's plenty of time to work on hip internal rotation. So sometimes I will alternate which leg I'm working on, so I'm not over resting, but most of the time I'll have enough time to get hip rotation work on both legs in my rest sets, and that's what I'll do in between my squats. And so maybe for the first 2 sets of squats, in between those, I will do like pails rails for hip internal rotation, and that position's going to vary depending on the person. I do it in several different positions because I like to train different options with the same stimulus. So that might be the first 2. The second 2 might be some end range, like lift offs or passive range holds, where now I'm working on pails rails really helps you to access tissues in those positions. But now I'm really working on trying to close the gap between my active and passive deficit a little bit more. And so I'll do those. And then maybe the 4th set, I'll do some capsular cars, which is just me exploring my workspace in a particular position. I like to do these in 90-90. Sometimes I'll do them in standing. By 90-90, I mean supine, like on my back with my knees elevated and hips at 90 degrees. Capsular cars are just exploring your capsular tissue, internal and external range of motion. That's what the capsule of the hip that's what targets the capsule of the hip the most. So you'll notice that we don't do that very often in fitness. So that's one of the reasons that I like to do this with squats. So that would be like maybe set 4. And then set 5, I would just finish with hip cars, right? That's exploring the new workspace that you had just gotten access to, that you had just worked on. It's also like hitting save on the work that you just did, right? So if you just worked on finding those tissues, now can you do it in more of a global movement where you're getting your hip into all those ranges of motion? It feels amazing. Feels great. And so usually that will be like one little way that I'll do my mobility with strength training. Like that's one of my favorite ways, is just kind of going down that. If you wanted to keep it even more simple, like if that sounded really complicated to you, because first of all, you don't know what all those things are, you could probably look at our YouTube and like learn all of those things. I like one day want to create like a glossary so we can understand all of them, but our YouTube has like a lot of demos of all of those exercises. But if you wanted to keep it even more simple, instead of doing the capsular cars, the lift offs, all of that, you're going to get a lot out of just doing pails and rails. And if I had to pick like one thing besides cars that I would work on for my mobility work, it would just be pails rails for like everything. I love pails rails. They stand for progressive angular isometric loading and regressive angular isometric loading. They're just isometrics in positions that you don't typically have control of. And so they help you to build awareness, build strength. They also help you talk to tissues that normally wouldn't get loaded in normal movements because you don't have access to them. There's a lot of good things happening with those. So if that is you, then maybe just during like 2 or 3 of the sets that you would just do some pails rails, right? So for hip internal rotation, maybe hip IR, internal rotation, isn't your like problem. Maybe it's ER or something along those lines, but like put your deficit of like a joint that you're kind of working on in the lift. So like if you know hips are what suck, pair them with something where you use your hips, like, you know, a squat or something along those lines. So that is like one way. Pick your deficits that you know and pair them with your main lifts. And maybe that's just like you're getting in all of that work and you're just picking that, and that's like your goal for the training block. Totally cool, totally fine. We're going to have phases where we work on certain things. You don't have to work on everything all at once, right? Something to keep in mind. So that's number 1. It's my favorite way to kind of implement it. Number 2 is going to be very similar, but instead of just working on something that you know you lack, like your deficit, you can just superset or just program in for the day. It doesn't have to be a superset. An end range option that is similar to the movements that you're doing in your exercises that day. So the difference here is you're kind of going to the end range and just training the end range of the movement. So let me give you examples so you can kind of figure out what I'm saying here if you're a little lost. One example would be if you're doing an overhead press. If you're doing an overhead press, your shoulders are going into flexion. That is the movement for your shoulders reaching, your arms reaching overhead towards your ears. So an example of working with overhead shoulder flexion would just be shoulder flexion liftoffs, where you're getting into a place where you cannot use your spine at that end range and you're just doing some liftoffs. You might want to pair this with your shoulder overhead press, or you might want to do it as like a separate exercise paired with one of your exercises afterwards, or just like at the end as like a quote unquote finisher, where you're just doing a couple sets. I usually don't do more, like if I'm doing liftoffs or end range options, like I don't do a ton of reps. I'm typically making it so hard that I can only do so many and I fatigue pretty quickly. That's what I'm looking for. You just have to be really careful about your setup, because the end range positions are where we typically like to compensate a lot. And the goal is to learn how to access the tissues we want without everything else taking over to help reduce some of those compensations. So that would be one example. Another example might be if you are doing bent over row. So some version of a dumbbell, a kettlebell row, something along those lines. You might pair that with a shoulder blade retraction liftoff. I like to do those prone, and that just gets you into a little bit more connection with your shoulder blade, which is what you're training a lot with a bent over row. Another example, or a final example, would be like a deadlift. That movement is involving hip flexion with more of a straight leg, like not a bent knee. If you're doing RDLs, you have a slightly bent knee, right? But it's not like a fully bent knee. It's more straight to target your hamstrings. So if you're doing that, you may want to pair that with some straight leg pails rails, or some straight leg liftoffs or end range options, just like that. And again, you can do the deadlifts paired with them, or you can do your deadlifts followed by your like other couple of exercises you're doing for accessories that day, if you are, and then finish with the mobility stuff that I just covered. Now, I just want you to keep in mind, we tend to, you may have less time for all the accessories you want to do. So in limited time and resources, sometimes we get into that, well, I ran out of time, so I just cut off my mobility stuff. And like, if you think about the vitality of what keeps you in the gym, it's the mobility work that's going to keep you there. And everybody's going to be a little bit different, everybody is going to be a little bit different when it comes to how much mobility work they should be doing. But more often than not, the more taste that you get of how much better it can make you feel and how much more ROI you're going to get in the gym when you have more mobility and more access to tissues, you're going to start to prioritize it a little bit more. Up front, nobody wants to. I totally get it. It's really hard. It's like 100 times more difficult than most of the other fitness stuff we do. You don't feel like you're doing much. And when it comes to humans, fitness is already hard. We're already designed to not want to do it. So when we're doing it, we want to feel like we did something really great. We have a lot, people more often have a lot more experience with, okay, maybe I know that I have to go in the gym and lifting weights. I get stronger when I'm just consistent. I'm not running myself into the ground. And because I have the experience, I trust the process, right? But when it comes to mobility, if you're new and you've never done it, you're like, I don't have anything to go off of. So just keep in mind that like, if you're just doing this at first, just do a little bit so you can get the experience of how much better it makes you feel and how much more connected in all of the other exercises that you do. So if that's you, then just keep in mind that you're still going to have to replace maybe an exercise you already typically like to do. And maybe if you typically have like a lower body pull where your exercise is a deadlift day and you have like regular deadlifts programmed, you have single leg deadlifts, and then you have like, I don't know, like the hamstring machine exercise, maybe taking out the hamstring machine exercise and implementing straight leg hip flexion work, like I just mentioned, like pails, rails, because you're limited on time again. You're still training those tissues. It's just a little bit different. So that is how to kind of implement that when you're limited in time and resources. I promise that mobility work is going to make you feel really good when we implement it and we're consistent with it. So you may have to trade off a little bit, and you may only have to do that in blocks too, by the way. Like you might have a block where you're working on mobility more consistently, and then you might have a block where you're not. So that is going to be my second way, is just pairing the like an end range option that is similar to the movement you're doing. So this is going to be more linear versus earlier what I said was a deficit work, where we're kind of working on thinking about the tissues in our body, like our capsule, restoring that rather than just restoring the pure movement. Those are different on the hierarchy, and we want capsular space, workspace, and capsular tissue health as well. So that's going to be the second one. The third way, and the most simple thing that you can do, and this is like very, very specific, is taking what you're already doing and upgrading it. Almost everybody already has this type of work in their program, and I want you to take it. I want you to make it better. Like I want you to take what you're already doing and spending your time on and just get a little more out of it. That's going to help you way long-term down the road. And that's going to be taking the traditional core work that you do. Think about your planks and your crunches and your sit-ups and all of those types of work, maybe your side bends, and replacing it with spine-specific work. Now, when I say you're replacing it with spine-specific work, it's still working on what you're considering as your core, which is really your abdominal muscles. The point of your abdominal muscles is really to control your spine. The problem with most traditional exercises is originally there was a problem with a lot of crunches and like sit-ups and things like that. And a lot of that was because we were just throwing ourselves around with a lot of momentum, where we were ignoring our spine. We were never training it. We don't have access to a lot of those tissues, and our spine has slowly kind of become a little bit weaker. And then we threw ourselves around, and we tend to move only in one or two segments, and then we end up with some low back issues down the road after this has happened lots and lots of times. Instead, I think that we moved into now we should just never move the spine, right? If those sit-ups are gradually creating issues, then let's just not move the spine and we should be good, right? Wrong. If we weren't supposed to move the spine, we wouldn't be moving the spine. And so training neutral might be necessary for some people, and I'm using quotes for neutral because it's not a well-defined amount of range of motion. And we lose neutral if we only live in neutral, because neutral is the middle between two extremes. And so if we stop achieving extremes, we lose that, and now we don't even have a neutral. Even our neutral feels like an extreme, and this is why only training in neutral becomes a problem and puts us higher risk down the road for more back injuries. So instead of doing the crunches, we went to isometrics, which was like carries and holds and Pallof presses and planks. And those are not bad exercises. I still program them. But eventually, or in along with those, I would like to see a little bit more spine control exercises. What that usually looks like for most people is segmentation. You cannot start anything more crazy than segmentation, because if you don't know where your spine is in space and you don't have control of segmentation and you're just moving one or two segments, then those are the only ones you're going to be loading, no matter what fancy spine mobility exercise you do. If you cannot control your spine segmentation and you don't have access to those segments, you do not have access to them then when we add load or speed or a more complicated exercise. So it's always going to start with a lot of segmentation, and that can be considered an exercise. And when you do segmentation, the way that I typically coach, you're going to feel your abs, and then you're going to feel abs you never felt before, and then you're going to have more access to more abs, which means you're going to be able to train them more and get more out of your exercises. So that's where I usually start with people. From there, it's going to be things like hinge point training or a segmental like eccentric sit-up. Maybe we work on like a bodyweight Jefferson curl. There's a lot of different variations of things that I work, but it's controlling and segmenting through and eventually adding load with progressive overload, right? That's what I would like to see when it comes to spine exercises or our quote unquote core exercises, rather than just rehashing the carries and the static holds and things like that. So we always want to be thinking about progressing if we are doing those to start. Keep in mind that that's not me saying those exercises are bad. It's just, yes, we should resist movement, but eventually we should be able to control it as well, because you want to be able to move through your spine, and movement is how we keep our spines healthy. So that is going to be the third way. And a little like a last bonus way, I'd say, is going to be stretching. I didn't talk about stretching in here because you're not going to sit in the middle of your squats in between and just like stretch for 2 minutes, right? Sometimes we can we can break up our stretches and do like a 30-second stretch in between our sets. By the way, that's totally fine if that is a way for you to get it in. Because yes, I would prefer the 2 minutes to be like a prolonged stretch, but you can accumulate that in a shorter bout of time where it's broken up. So think like multiple sets of 30 seconds. I often will talk about 30-second or 10-second stretches being like not long enough. And that's true when that is all you're doing for the day. It's not going to be enough. Like 10 seconds of bicep curls once a week is not going to be enough to make a change, especially when it's not a lot of load, right? So your static prolonged stretches, yes, those are still necessary for a lot of people. Those are going to be, you can break them up in between your main lifts, totally fine. But more often than not, I'm actually having people do those before their lifts. So I'm injecting them into their warm-ups. And I know the fitness world loves to talk about how dynamic stretches are so much better beforehand, and that's like the golden Bible thing we need to do for our warm-ups, for our general lifts, and I understand the sentiment behind that, but that is because they are trying to give like general application, general advice, when I'm referring to something more specific. If you know you need to stretch because you're limited in your passive range of motion for what you need or for what your body needs to do the things that you want to do, then you know that you need to static stretch. And it doesn't matter really when you get it in, you just want to get it in. For some people, those static stretches can actually make their lifts feel a lot better. And I know there is some research that shows a small decrease in power output right after a prolonged stretch. But again, this goes back to, what is your ultimate goal? Is your goal to train tissues and to make your body better? Or is your goal to just lift as heavy as freaking possible? And if it's that, then maybe yes, don't stretch before your lifts. By the way, there's a little bit of research actually that shows there was not a change in power output. So I'm sure it's highly individual, and some of the research on stretching and all of that is really interesting because we never know the protocol they're using, or if the person needed to stretch, or if they're in a position where they feel stretch, or if they're pushing in a closing angle stuff, because I think that happens a lot more than we think, even in the research studies. So that was my little side note about that. But it goes back to your goal. So if you're like a power lifter, you're preparing for a competition, maybe you don't want to stretch because like you're trying to do everything you can to just stay consistent. Maybe your dynamic stretches, whatever it is that's like your typical thing. Most athletes kind of are like, I got to do the exact same, like they're like superstitious, but it also kind of helps them get into the headspace. So it's not just superstition. It's like this like mental thing to get them in the headspace to really perform their best. That's probably not you. So I'm just assuming it's not. And if it is, then, take this with a grain of salt. But because it's not you and you're just trying to lift and move and feel good and stay healthy, and maybe you want to be strong and things like that, but like your ultimate goal is, I want to feel good. Like I want to feel good in my body. I want to take care of my body for decades to come. And if that's you, then yes, stretching before you lift is totally going to be fine. If it's a stretch that one, you need, two, that you're stretching in a way that like you're supposed to, again, we're avoiding closing angle stuff, then doing it before your lift might help you, for example, get down into a deeper squat. We do have a temporary increase in range of motion after a prolonged stretch like that. So it may actually help you to feel a little more comfy in your squat, which might actually help you lift heavier. So I talked about hip internal rotation, and for a lot of people who are limited in their hip internal rotation, like their capsular space, hip internal rotation actually kind of stretches the tissue, the capsule part of the tissue, which is like our ligamentous tissue. It's the deepest layer of our joint, essentially. And so when we make that a little bit more pliable or temporarily kind of relaxed, most likely you're not relaxing the capsule, you're getting the other muscles around it to relax. But if you're doing that, you're going to give yourself a little bit more joint space, which is going to give you a little bit more room to play, which is going to feel a little more comfy. So you might be able to get into a little bit better of a position or a deeper squat. Same thing with like ankle mobility or something along those lines, or maybe it's like hamstring mobility when you are trying to deadlift. So that's going to be highly individual. So you have to take this information with a grain of salt and know if it applies to you or not. But if it does, stretching before you work out is not the worst thing. I'm here to tell you, like, it's not. And everything it depends and context matters, right? So I don't know how many times I say that on this podcast, but it's probably been like 100 already. But those are the 3 plus a bonus way that I like to put mobility with my strength training program. And I just want to like remind you that mainly it's just get some work in. I think we overcomplicate the programming, and I think we do that because I think social media makes us think we need this like programming that's like insane. And I just want to remind you that like sometimes I'll see programming that I think looks really cool, and it's very logical, science-based, and it is so overly complicated that that person that's following that programming probably or might not get better results just because it's more complex. Complexity doesn't necessarily guarantee better results. Just keep that in mind. So I like to keep things as simple as possible. And also remember that like the longer you've been doing this, sometimes you do want to get a little more complex, and that isn't necessarily just because you want to, because you think it'll get better results, but it also just might be you playing around, and that's me. So if you ever see me doing something and I talk about it and you're just like, that sounds really complicated, I promise it's probably just because I've been doing this for a while, and humans like novelty, but also I do like to kind of test things out and play around a little bit. So, but I've gotten a lot of results, and a lot of people get a lot of results from really basic, boring, simple things. So don't overestimate those types of things. So I hope that was helpful. If it is, as always, reach out to me. I love hearing from you. If you haven't already, go hit the 5-star review for me. Leave a review. I am so appreciative of that. And share this with somebody who might want to know about programming if you feel so inclined. If this was super interesting for you, we talk a little bit about how to blend these things in movement school, which will be launching again next year. So stay tuned for that. I'll come and talk about that again. But that is my course where I teach you how to assess and program mobility work. And it is perfect for any coach or clinician who kind of wants to learn a little bit more about all of this type of thing. So keep your ear out for that. I will let you know when we are doing signups again. And without further ado, I will talk to you on the next podcast.